give the people time. Give people what they want. Well. Don't you know you got to give the people what they want.
Hello and welcome to On the Money with NEDAP, a show about community economic justice in New York City. On the Money is brought to you by the Neighborhood Economic Development Advocacy Project. And each month we bring a different segment on financial justice issues affecting New Yorkers and New York City neighborhoods. My name is Sarah Ludwig and I'm your host today. We are lucky to have in our studio distinguished guest, Mike Hudson, an investigative reporter who's written some of the best exposés on predatory lending that you'll find anywhere. They've appeared in publications as ranging as the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Mother Jones, the Los Angeles Times, and also he's the author of a very important book, Merchants of Misery, that was written well before people talked about a foreclosure crisis and the subprime lending crisis that predicted a lot of the problems that we have today and certainly set the stage for defining what was happening in the credit arena in this country. We're going to spend most of this show dispelling some of the myths around the foreclosure and subprime lending crises. And I want to start, Mike, by asking you to talk to us a little bit about the myth that we are hearing that the foreclosure crisis is a new problem, that there's something that's happened that have led to hundreds of thousands of homeowners facing foreclosure.
It really isn't a new problem. It's just that the media, policymakers, and just sort of the general public has finally discovered that there's a problem there. It's certainly worse now than it has ever been in terms of the level of foreclosures, the number of people in trouble. But subprime lending, you know, the sort of risky mortgages to people who supposedly have bad credit, you know, this has been around for a long time, and questions about abusive practices, predatory lending, you know, these have been raised since the late 80s, early 90s. People have been losing their homes to foreclosure. The U.S. foreclosure rates have been, you know, ticking up for many years now. It's just that now we're at a worse place. Part of the reason is that the market, subprime lending was probably about $25 billion in mortgages in sort of the early to mid 90s. But it was around that time that Wall Street really kind of discovered this and discovered that they could make money at this by taking the income streams from these mortgages, putting them into what are called securities pools, and then selling bonds to investors all around the world, in Norway and Australia, you name it, pension funds, who sort of snapped up these investments.
Well, let's just step back for 1 second and define what we mean by subprime lending.
Right. The industry kind of defines it as riskier loans to borrowers who are less likely to repay, borrowers who have bad credit, borrowers who've had foreclosures in the past, who filed for bankruptcies in the past. And that's true to a degree, although, as I think we'll talk about it later in the show, one of the myths is that all borrowers who got subprime loans had bad credit, and a lot of them didn't. A lot of them were people who had actually good credit, who kind of got manipulated into getting loans which were more expensive than their credit scores and their ability to pay called for.
I mean, you're talking a little bit about how this industry grew in the 90s
Right.
with the securitization of subprime loans, the selling of these off on Wall Street as an investment interest. But where did they come from? I mean, how did it change the nature of lending to have these subprime loans, and how do they connect up with the foreclosures that we're seeing so pervasively today?
There have always been, you know, companies out there, lenders, you know, in sort of lower income, blue collar neighborhoods who lent money at really steep prices. You know, one of the big changes is that as more people gained home ownership, often through, you know, government programs, you know, the Veterans Administration loans, that kind of thing, people have had a lot more wealth. They might be cash poor and house rich. They might be sitting on a house that they paid $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 for back in the 60s or, you know, late 60s, and it's suddenly worth $75,000 or $100,000. And
in New York, we're talking, you know, a difference of $25,000 in the 60s to $500,000 or more.
Or $1 million now.
Yeah.
So people are sitting on a lot of equity, and there were a lot of lenders out there who decided, how can we tap into this? And back in the early 90s, a lot of big names, including Fleet Bank, started getting into the subprime market. Fleet got in a lot of trouble. There were investigations, and Fleet ended up paying some pretty major settlements, sort of 93, 94.
So what's the idea that Fleet was making these subprime loans? These are, by definition, loans that cost more because
Right.
there's this sense that they're at least theoretically being made to people who are higher credit risks.
Right.
Whether or not that's the case, we know that that doesn't really hold. But were they targeting people, and has that been part of the
Right.
aspect of?
One of the allegations against Fleet in particular, and against many of the other subprime lenders, is that they're targeting minority homeowners, African Americans, Latinos, and charging them even more than Caucasian homeowners of the same credit scores, the same same amount of family wealth, same ability to repay, and so there was a lot of discriminatory pricing, and there's been a lot of allegations over the years of just sort of fraudulent bait and switch salesmanship, promising borrowers one thing and then delivering something else, falsifying documents, forging borrowers' signatures on disclosure statements so the borrowers really don't even get a chance to know all the ins and outs of what are almost always pretty complex financial transactions.
And you're suggesting this has been going on now for much more than a decade, that this is not a new phenomenon that's causing the wave of
Right.
foreclosures that we're seeing.
Absolutely. I mean, there were lots of lawsuits. There were lots of government investigations going back into the early 90s. I spent a lot of time in 92, 93, 94 interviewing borrowers all over the country. It certainly has gotten worse, and in some ways more sophisticated. The frauds and the sort of abusive conduct has gotten more complex, more sophisticated. I remember I interviewed a former loan officer and branch manager for the Associates, which at the time was owned by Ford Motor Company, later was bought by Citigroup and became part of their City Financial Network. But this was sort of 95, 96. I interviewed this guy, and he said, that in their office they had a designated forger. They had a guy they could go to if they needed somebody to forge a signature.
That was his job.
Well, he did other things too, but that was his thing. And then years later, I was interviewing a loan officer for AmeriQuest Mortgage, sort of 2004, 2005 era. He said, we had in our office, if you needed a mortgage satisfaction document forged, you would go to Bill. If you needed a different document, you would go to somebody else. So they actually had specialists who could do this. And one of the allegations against AmeriQuest was that in their Tampa, Florida branch, they had something they called the art department, which was guys who basically just cut and pasted documents. They would take, for instance, we found one 401k statement which was used for 3 different borrowers. It only belonged to one of the borrowers, but someone had just had cut and pasted a different name and a different address onto this 401k statement to show that they had $20,000 in wealth to qualify them for this loan.